The house was calm, an eerie quiet hanging in the air. Autumn had settled in, wrapping everything in a subtle heaviness that seemed to press against the walls. My thoughts wandered, split between the looming pressure of school and the thrill of finally having the house to myself for the weekend. Dad had been away on business for weeks, and Mom had just returned from a trip to visit her sister, mentioning she'd soon be leaving again to catch up with an old friend. I can still picture the hint of exhaustion in her eyes as she shared her plans. She looked tired, as if she were trying to escape something, though I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. I nodded absent-mindedly, more focused on the thought of having the house to myself. The door clicked shut, and as soon as she was gone, I went straight to my room, feeling that unique sense of freedom fill the space around me. I tossed my backpack onto the floor, drew the blinds, and basked in a rare calm. Time passed without me noticing as I finally allowed myself to relax, immersing myself in my own world for the first time in ages. Then, the sound of a car door slamming shut yanked me back to reality, snapping me out of my daze. I froze. Mom shouldn't have been back yet. She had just left. The jangle of her keys at the door felt like a loud, intrusive noise, far more intense than it should have been. The door creaked open, and I heard her familiar, soothing voice. "Hello," she called, her tone as soft as always. But there was something different about it, a subtle shift that made my stomach tighten. Panic surged, too fast to stop. I scrambled, unsure of how to hide the evidence of my solitude, but it was too late. The doorknob turned, and there she was standing in the doorway. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, and in that instant, everything inside me froze, cold with dread. "Sorry," I started, but my voice felt small, empty. The confusion in her eyes was almost painful. She stared at me, really looked at me, as though trying to understand something she couldn't quite grasp. A heavy silence filled the room as she inhaled deeply, blinking as if trying to process what she had walked into. I wanted to explain, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, and I simply stood there, waiting for her to say something, anything, to break the stillness between us. Her face softened, just barely. It wasn't anger that flickered in her eyes, but something far more complicated. After what felt like an eternity, she exhaled quietly, her face shifting into an unreadable expression. She blinked a few times, then, without another word, turned and left the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I could hear her footsteps retreating down the hallway, growing softer as she moved further away. I let out a slow breath, my mind spinning with a mix of embarrassment, confusion, and something else I couldn't name. The tension in the house was thick, heavy, like fog settling in. Every step I took felt weighted, and I found myself avoiding her, not because I was scared, but because it was simply too uncomfortable. My mind kept replaying the moment she'd walked in, her surprised face, and the silence that followed. It was hard to shake off. As much as I tried to move past it, the memory clung to me, casting a shadow over everything I thought about. Later that night, just as I was trying to focus on a textbook, I heard a light knock at my door. I froze for a moment, unsure if I was ready to face her. But then her voice, soft yet hesitant, broke the quiet. "Are you busy?" she asked. I took a deep breath, closing my book and steeling myself. "No, just reading," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. She opened the door, peeking in with a small smile. "I was thinking," she said. "Do you remember when we used to stay up all night watching movies together? Those marathons?" There was a trace of nostalgia in her voice, and for a split second, I saw the mother I remembered from my childhood. Warm, lively, always trying to bring us all together. "Yeah, of course I remember," I said, a bit of warmth creeping into my voice without me meaning to. "Do you want to do that again?" she asked, almost shyly. "We could pick one of those old classics you used to love." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn her down, to avoid the awkwardness that still hung in the air. But another part, the part that missed our closeness, urged me to say yes. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Sure, why not?" A few minutes later, we were both settled in the living room, a stack of DVDs sitting on the coffee table. The soft glow of the lamp cast a warm light over the room. She was curled up on the couch, looking surprisingly relaxed, as though all the tension from earlier had vanished. I felt myself start to unwind too, letting my guard drop just a little. We picked a movie we both knew by heart, the kind you can quote along with. As the film started, she laughed at a familiar line, and I found myself laughing too. Slowly, the tension between us melted away, replaced by a surprising ease. It felt natural, almost comforting, and I realized just how much I'd missed these moments, the companionship, the comfort of being together. About halfway through the movie, she reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm glad we're doing this," she said softly, meeting my eyes for a brief moment before looking away. A warmth spread through me, calming and reassuring. "Me too," I replied, almost whispering, feeling an unspoken connection pulling us closer. I wasn't entirely sure what was happening, but in that moment, everything felt right. It wasn't until later, as the credits rolled, that I realized she hadn't let go of my hand. She looked at me, her face soft, almost vulnerable. The silence between us was thick with unspoken words. Then, unexpectedly, she leaned in and pressed her lips gently against my cheek. I froze, taken off guard. It was quick, almost innocent, but the tenderness in that simple gesture felt deeper than anything I had experienced before. She turned away quickly, and for a moment, we sat in silence. We were both too stunned to say anything. She cleared her throat, shifting a little away, as if she'd caught herself in the moment. "Good night," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. She stood up, turning toward the hallway, and I was left there, sitting alone in the dim light, the soft hum of the DVD player filling the silence. My mind raced, replaying that moment over and over again. The days that followed felt different, charged with an unspoken awareness between us. We didn't mention that night, the movie, the laughter, or the soft brush of her lips on my cheek, but it was there, hanging in the air. Every glance, every small interaction felt loaded, like something unspoken hovered just below the surface. I wanted to bring it up, to clear the air, but the words never came. They were stuck somewhere in my chest, leaving us in this quiet, uncertain limbo. One afternoon, she knocked gently on my door again. This time, she felt different, calm, almost like she had made peace with something inside herself. "I was thinking," she said as she stepped in, "why don't we get out of the house? Maybe take a little road trip, just the two of us?" I blinked, surprised by the suggestion. "A road trip?" I asked. "Yeah," she said with a small, knowing smile, like she'd expected that question. "I thought it might do us good. We could go somewhere peaceful, maybe just sit by the lake and clear our minds." Her ideas struck a chord with me, like a silent understanding between us that we both needed a change of scenery. "Sure," I agreed, nodding. "That sounds nice." The drive turned out to be longer than I expected, but the silence between us was surprisingly comfortable. Soft tunes played from her playlist, filling the car with a sense of nostalgia. I watched the trees blur by outside the window, the low hum of the engine offering a soothing rhythm to my thoughts. It felt like we were both searching for something on this journey, maybe a way to move forward or simply a break from the tension that had settled between us. When we finally reached the lake, the sight took my breath away. The water was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the sky. It felt untouched, like we had entered a different world, just the two of us. We found a spot near the shore, spreading out a blanket and sitting down, the vast lake stretching out before us. She sighed, leaning back and closing her eyes as the breeze tugged at her hair. "I miss this," she murmured almost to herself. "I miss just being." I watched her, a pang of something I couldn't quite name stirring inside me. "Yeah," I said softly, my gaze drifting out over the water. "Sometimes it feels like everything is moving so fast, and we're just stuck." She opened her eyes and glanced at me, her expression a mix of something familiar and new. "It's hard to find moments like this anymore," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Life just takes over, doesn't it?" I nodded, the weight of her words settling in my chest. We sat there in silence for a while, just watching the lake and letting the peace of the moment fill the space between us. It felt like a release, a chance to breathe and sync with the world around us. Then, without warning, she reached out and placed her hand over mine, her touch warm and comforting. I looked down at our hands, a sudden warmth rushing up my arm. It was such a simple gesture, but it carried an unspoken weight neither of us seemed ready to address. "This is nice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I could feel her eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. I knew that if I did, I'd see something I wasn't prepared to face. The silence lingered, heavy but somehow soothing. And then, without a word, she rested her head on my shoulder, letting out a soft sigh. It was a small gesture, one we'd shared countless times before, but this time it felt different. There was a quiet intimacy to it, something that went beyond simple comfort. After a long while, she lifted her head and looked at me, her eyes soft, searching. My heart skipped a beat. "I'm glad we did this," she said quietly, her voice filled with a tenderness that struck me deeper than I expected. "Me too," I replied, barely able to steady my voice. We didn't move. We just stayed there, locked in each other's gaze, and I felt a strange pull, an invisible connection between us. Then, almost without thinking, I leaned in, pressing my lips softly against hers in a tentative kiss. It was brief, barely a whisper, but the impact was enough to leave me breathless. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she stayed close, her gaze filled with a quiet understanding. Neither of us said anything, didn't acknowledge what had just happened. She simply rested her head back on my shoulder, and we went back to sitting in silence, watching the lake as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The tension between us only deepened with each passing day. Neither of us mentioned that afternoon by the lake, but I could feel its weight in every glance, every accidental touch. It was a silent connection neither of us knew how to break or address. Part of me wanted to confront it, to face whatever it was, but a larger part of me feared what would happen if we did. It was late one night, long after I had settled into my room and was trying to focus on my studies, when I heard a soft knock on my door. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, gentle but insistent. "Are you still awake?" she asked, her voice barely audible from the other side of the door. I hesitated, the pages of my textbook blurring as my pulse quickened. "Yeah, I'm up. You can come in," I replied, closing my book and sitting up as she stepped into the room. She was wearing a soft, oversized sweater, her hair a little messy as if she hadn't been able to sleep either. She looked at me with an unreadable expression, a mix of hesitation and something deeper, something that mirrored the turmoil inside me. "I know it's late," she said softly, glancing away as if second-guessing herself. "But do you think you could join me in the living room? I'm feeling a little restless." I nodded, the same pull I'd felt by the lake tugging at me. "Of course. Let's go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We walked silently down the hall, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this late-night invitation than she was letting on. The house was dark and still. Shadows stretched across the walls as we made our way to the living room. She had already set up a cozy little spot on the couch, with blankets neatly arranged and a bottle of wine sitting on the coffee table. Its deep red color caught the light from a single dim lamp. She poured us each a glass, her movements slow and deliberate, almost like a ritual. We sat in silence for a while, sipping our wine in small gulps, letting the warmth spread through us. "I couldn't sleep," she finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking about everything." I nodded, my heart racing. "Yeah, me too," I said, surprised by how honest I sounded. It's like so much has changed, even though we're both pretending it hasn't." She stared at her glass, her fingers tracing the rim. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely a murmur. "And I don't know what to do about it." There was a rawness in her voice that made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach out, to offer something to make it better, but I didn't know what to say. Instead, I just watched as she took a shaky breath, glancing over at me with a quiet, desperate look in her eyes. "It's like I'm losing you," she continued, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "And I don't know how to hold on. Everything feels so different, and I'm not sure if it's supposed to." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had never heard her speak so openly, so vulnerably. I put my glass down, my hand instinctively reaching out to cover hers. "You're not losing me," I said softly, feeling the weight of each word. "I'm still here. We're both still here." She looked up at me, her expression a fragile mix of hope and fear. For a moment, we just locked eyes, the unspoken tension between us thickening, like a taut thread ready to snap. I didn't know who moved first, but suddenly we were close, our faces just inches apart. Her breath was warm against my skin, and I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. But then she closed them, leaning in, her lips brushing against mine in a tentative, questioning kiss. This kiss was different, soft, hesitant, as though she was testing the waters, unsure how far to go. But there was a warmth in it, a gentleness that felt both familiar and new, something comforting wrapped in a complexity neither of us could explain. We pulled back, the silence hanging heavy between us, filled with words neither of us knew how to speak. She looked at me, her eyes wide, searching for answers in my face, but I had none to offer. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know. I don't know why I did that." I shook my head, trying to find my voice. "You don't have to apologize," I said, my words barely steady. I didn't want to stop you." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "This is all so confusing," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what's right anymore." We sat there, the weight of our confusion pressing down on us, a strange bond between us that was both painful and oddly comforting. She leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. We stayed that way for what felt like hours, the silence between us saying more than words ever could, the warmth of our embrace offering the comfort we couldn't find anywhere else. As the night wore on, the exhaustion of everything that had happened started to weigh heavily on my mind. Eventually, she drifted off to sleep beside me, her breathing soft and steady, her hands still resting in mine. I stayed awake, watching her chest rise and fall, my mind spinning with questions I didn't know how to answer. What were we doing? What did this all mean for us? I couldn't ignore the feelings that had surfaced, the emotions I had buried for so long. But the fear of crossing a line I couldn't return from kept me frozen. When the first light of dawn started to creep through the curtains, I gently pulled away from her, covering her with a blanket and quietly retreating to my room. I needed space, time to think, to process everything that had happened. As I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I realized that things would never be the same between us. That night had changed everything. Something had left its mark on our relationship, something that couldn't be erased. And as much as I wanted to hold on to the closeness we had, I knew we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, a precipice that could either bring us closer or tear us apart. The days that followed felt hollow, as if we were in the same house, but living in completely different worlds. I couldn't look at her without replaying the confession in my mind, the way her head had rested on my shoulder, the sensation of her fingers intertwined with mine. There was an ache in my chest that I couldn't shake, a heaviness between us that was impossible to ignore. But we never spoke of it. Each time I tried to bring it up, to somehow acknowledge it, the words evaporated, leaving me trapped in my own silence. One evening, just as I was settling in to study, she appeared in my doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see the tightness around her eyes, a clear sign of the tension she was holding in. She hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, crossing an invisible line. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice strained. I can't keep pretending everything's normal." I closed my book, my pulse quickening. I'd been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, I found myself dreading it. "I know," I replied, barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to handle this either." She took a deep breath and slowly walked over to sit beside me on the bed. The silence between us felt thick, unresolved, hanging heavily in the air. She fidgeted with her hands, a small, nervous gesture that was completely unlike her, and I realized just how deeply this whole situation had affected her. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice trembling. I think we need some boundaries, she said, each word carefully chosen. Things have been blurred lately, and I'm not sure that's safe for us. The word safe hit me hard, cutting through the fog of emotions clouding my thoughts. I nodded slowly, unable to trust myself to speak. I wanted to ask her how we had gotten here, why we had crossed a line we couldn't come back from, but the words felt too raw, too exposing. Maybe we just need to take a step back, she continued, her gaze flickering toward me, filled with uncertainty. To remember who we are to each other. My heart dropped. I knew she was right. But the thought of pulling back, of returning to the distance that used to exist between us, felt like a loss I wasn't ready to face. She reached out, placing her hand over mine. The touch was warm, comforting, but there was a fragility in it that felt like the beginning of something final. "I'm still your mother," she whispered, as if reminding herself as much as me. "And I love you as my son. We have to remember that." I looked at her, feeling the weight of her words press into my chest. "I know," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. "I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how to make this feeling go away." Her eyes filled with a sadness, and something that almost looked like regret. "It's not easy," she admitted, her voice raw with emotion. "I don't know how we got here, but whatever this is, it can't continue. We have to find a way back." For a long moment, we just sat there in silence. The space between us was heavy with all the things we couldn't say, a silent ache that neither of us knew how to express. And then, almost without thinking, she leaned in, pressing a gentle, lingering kiss to my forehead. It was a mother's kiss, tender and full of unspoken love. But this one carried a weight that was different, a sense of finality that felt like closure. "I just want you to know," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion, "that you mean everything to me. I never wanted things to get so complicated." I swallowed, feeling a tightness in my throat. "I know," I replied, barely able to keep my voice steady. "You mean everything to me, too." We sat in silence again, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The weight of her words pressed down on us, but there was a quiet understanding between us, a silent agreement that this was where we would draw the line, where we would try to rebuild what had been lost. When she stood to leave, she gave me a sad, lingering smile. "Good night," she whispered, turning toward the door. But just as she reached the threshold, she paused, her back still to me. "Sometimes I wonder," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, "if things could have been different. If maybe in another life, we could have been something else." My heart stopped at her words, caught in the weight of them. She didn't turn to look at me, and I didn't move. I was afraid that if I did, the spell of the moment would break. I wanted to reach out, to say something, anything that would shatter the stillness of the room. But I couldn't. Without another word, she left, her footsteps fading down the hallway. I sat there, her words echoing in my mind, filling me with a hollow ache. Could things have been different? Could we have been something else? I didn't know. And the question hung there, unanswered, as the silence of the empty room closed in around me.